we might as well. Can't fit any more people in here, right? So right off the bat, I'd like to tell you about next week. Next week, we have Ann Hood, who is a retired TWA flight attendant, and one of our board members is also a retired flight attendant. Her name is Leslie Wallace, and she is a retired Eastern Airlines stewardess. You might as well have been pilot, actually. But and her stories are so funny that the two of them together should be a hoot. So this week, I want to thank Titcombs for being here week after week to sell books. If you've never been to their bookstore on 6A, it's a treat. So you really should get over there and check it out. I want to thank tonight's sponsors. I hope they all made it here. Lucy Loomis, Dan Santos, Stephen Lynn Hesslinger, I saw them, hi, and Lisa Donahue. So thank you very much. And as you know, Jude usually does our baked goods, but we also have volunteer bakers, and we always appreciate them. And tonight we have Sue Schrader, who says she has some double chocolate thing. So anyway, I want to introduce our speaker this evening, and I did steal some stuff off the internet, and I apologize for that, but some of it was so good that I have to tell you. One of the articles said that Emily Franklin wanted to be a, quote, singing, tap dancing doctor who wrote books. I think that's so great. But early on, apparently, she realized she was not a tap dancer and not really a singer. But so she studied at Oxford. She got a degree in neuroscience and writing from Sarah Lawrence. She considered becoming a doctor, but meanwhile had what she called character-building relationships. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So she traveled extensively, had a short stint as a chef, went to Dartmouth and earned her master's degree in media studies and writing. Met her husband in Martha's Vineyard. He's a doctor. He plays the piano and she sings. They marry, they have a family. So she is the author of more than 20 books, and several of her novels and poetry anthologies have been award-winning. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Boston Globe, and other publications. Lioness of Boston is in its 6th printing, and thanks to you this evening, will shortly be in its 7th printing. So I'd like to introduce with pride Emily Franklin.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And thanks, Anne, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Titcombs for selling out of books. And thank you all for buying the book or thinking about buying the book or sponsoring tonight or just showing up on a beautiful summer evening to talk about literature. It's always so exciting to see a room full of people here in support of books. So Anne wanted me to talk a little bit in depth about Isabella Stewart Gardner. So for those of you who have read the book, you won't have to sit through me explaining everything about the book. And for those of you who haven't read the book, you will get enough of a taste of the book that maybe it will whet your appetite. But I will speak for a little bit and do a very quick reading, and then I'm open to questions, and you can ask me questions about the Lioness of Boston. You can ask me about my 20-something books. I write, just so you know, in many different genres. I started off as a poet. I write short stories, I write memoir, cookbook, and fiction, and as well as young adult fiction. But when you ask me questions, you can ask about my writing life. Yes, I have 4 kids. As the bio on the book says, I live outside of Boston, and I have 2 dogs large enough to be lions. I definitely don't tap dance. I can sing very well, that's true. I can sing, and I write a lot about medicine and science, but I really cannot dance at all. My sister is here tonight, and she can attest to this. She often laughs at my expense. So I am going to just do a little talk about Isabella. But thank you all for being here. So just out of curiosity, how many people here have actually been to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum? So many, but not all. So, if you have been or you haven't been, this is a stunning Venetian-style palace right in the heart of Boston. So we're so lucky to have it be close. When I speak to people out of state or on the other side of the country, they might never get to visit, and so we're so lucky that we can take field trips there. But I grew up half in London and half in Boston, and in those Boston years, I would often go to the Gardner with my dad. It was really a special place for us, and when I first went, I really thought that it was magic. If you've been there, the interior courtyard is just stunning. And I just marveled at the bright orchids and the clusters of calla lilies and all of the flowers that change, seasonally. And it was really the first time in my life that I had thought about boundaries between spaces disappearing, right? The outside became the inside. And I wandered those vast rooms. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, has just such an astonishing array of masterworks of art, but also, tables and chairs and vases and glass perfume vials and even a lock of Robert Browning's hair. I know. And also just so many chairs. I don't know when the last time you were there, but it's possible that Isabella had a little bit of a chair hoarding problem. I really think she had an issue. There's about 14,000 chairs, and obviously that's just too many. But what I was struck, and some of these chairs, are these priceless Duncan Fife chairs, and some of them are these very simple metal garden chairs. And so even on those first visits with my dad, I was really struck by the fact that this is a museum that was unlike any other museum I had ever been to, and its collection really suggested that anything could be art. And that was very exciting to me, particularly as a young creative person. And as a senior in high school, I went to the museum on a field trip, and it was March of 1990, and I sat in the very cavernous Dutch room, and I wrote a paper on Rembrandt's Storm in the Sea of Galilee and Vermeer's The Concert. And 10 days later, those paintings were cut from their frames and stolen in one of the largest art heists in history. I will tell you that I have been touring for this book for about a year and a half, and at every single event, I am asked if I know where the stolen artwork is. I actually think it's so sweet that people would somehow think that I would know. I don't know. So don't make that one of your questions. Where is the art? I don't know. There is still a $10 million reward, so if you wanted that, you could go on a sleuthing mission yourself. But so those artworks were stolen, and Boston, you may remember at that time, was very captivated by this heist, and we're still really captivated, right? We have the Netflix series that maybe you've seen, but what really captivated me were these empty frames, and you can see there. So I don't know when the last time you visited was, but when you go and stand in front of these empty frames, it's really quite moving and really quite sad. And so for me, that became a big metaphor, right? I started off as a poet, so I thought in metaphors. And when I would think about these empty frames, because of the directive that Isabella gave, nothing can ever be moved or changed, and those empty frames are there as a marker of hope for their safe return, but also because nothing can be changed. I really kept thinking over years and years, about the empty frames that we all carry with us, right? None of us gets out of here alive. And we all have these empty frames that we carry around with us. And sometimes they're on display, and sometimes they're hidden deep within us, and we don't share them with other people. But that metaphor really stuck with me. And so I knew that that was living within me. So many Bostonians, I realized when I would go back to the museum, know more about the artwork that's housed at the museum than who Isabella was and how she came to become the first woman in the United States to open up a museum. And she really paved the way for other people like Peggy Guggenheim, who followed in her footsteps. So I'll tell you a little bit about Isabella. She was born in 1840 into a wealthy Scottish family who made their money largely by importing Irish linen. And she went to finishing school in Paris, and while she was there, she befriended Bostonian Julia Gardner. When spirited Isabella came to Boston to visit Julia after their time in Paris, she met Julia's brother, the very eligible John Jack Lowell Gardner. A couple of years later, they married. And Isabella moved to Boston when she was only 20 years old. She really hoped to settle into Boston life, living with her new husband on Beacon Street in a house that was given to them by Isabella's father as a wedding gift. Their house was in the Back Bay, which, as you know, was an area of Boston, but it had at that point only just been filled in. It was swampland. And Isabella and Jack led the way for other high society families to move into the neighborhood. They made it very fashionable. So Isabella arrived with her usual enthusiasm and high hopes, but Boston did not embrace Isabella Stewart Gardner. It was a pretty closed society at that time, and in some ways still is a little bit of a more conservative, closed society. So I think I'm going to read a very quick scene. I know sometimes when authors say they're going to read, everybody has a little clutch of panic, like we're going to sit here, the sun is going to set, the sun is going to rise, and I'm still going to be reading. Page 469. It's not. It's about a minute and a half. So don't worry. All you need to know if you haven't read the book is the way that the novel is structured. It has a prologue in which the older Isabella, who's in her 80s, is looking back on her life and reflecting. And then we jump right back into 1861 when Isabella is moving to Boston, and as I said, she's 20 years old. You get the older Isabella visiting throughout the novel and, at different points, but at this point, it's the earlier part of the novel, and Isabella's moved to Boston, and all you really need to know for setup is she and Jack are going to a dinner party, and she is dreading it. Evenings collected Putnams and Elliots, Amory's, Cabot's, Lowell's, Warren's, Hallowell's, Welds, and others, families Oliver Wendell Holmes had summed up as Brahmins in his recent novel, as though they were all interchangeable, elite without uniqueness. I felt a growing despair with this. I wanted the belonging and yet loathed the neediness that ensnared me, the idea that to be integral meant being one of them, and by definition, thus not myself, even if I wasn't yet quite sure of who that was either. One of the rules for dinner parties, none of the diners ought to feel superior to the others, and yet I felt myself on the lowest rung. We entered the drawing room on the heels of Miss Appleton, whose complexion glowed rosy atop her pale champagne dress, ringlets bobbing and dancing in the light like a sea creature, beautiful and deadly. Mrs. Amory, in green silk pierced through with tidy navy ribbon, embraced Miss Appleton warmly. We waited a moment so as not to intrude, which was fine for Jack. Men may stand and look around the room and are assumed to be thinking, perhaps measuring the room's dimensions. But women stand and often feel foolish, as though we are lost, or, in my view, as though we are always in the wrong place. I wore a dress that had arrived the day before, sent from Douceur in Paris, where I had visited first with my parents and Jack's sister Julia back when we were still in school. Now I saw Miss Appleton take in the yardage of my outfit, nipped too much at the waist for Boston, lined with buttons on either side. I had thought the sketches glorious, different, and only now realized difference ought never be the goal. Miss Appleton's eyes wandered over my dress as she held her stunning face statue still. How unusual. Beautiful people can afford a touch of cruelty. Other guests arrived, comfortable in the house as regulars in the dinner party rotation. The room was grand in the understated Boston way. Upholstered fine furniture, lighting neither too bright nor too dim, nothing too showy, nothing that appeared recently acquired, for part of the custom of this realm was to present the self and one's house as always having been this way. I was the only new addition. So Belle, as Isabella was called then, tried hard to fit into the Brahmin life. She really wanted to belong, but she also had her opinions, and she wasn't shy about expressing them. Her outspoken nature and her unique style did not sit well with the more formal Bostonians. She was ostracized by women for her lack of social grace, and by men for having views on matters that really should have just been the purview of her husband. And Isabella struggled to fulfill the role that was given to her. She was determined, and she kept trying despite her social rejections, and she kept thinking that acceptance in society would really give her personal satisfaction. So she had these personal tragedies, which I'm not going to get into the details of, and I will ask if you are going to ask a question and you've read the book. It is based on a real life, obviously, but there are still spoilers, so I'm not going to get into that. So she had these tragedies that really shook her world, and she fell into a very deep depression. And on the advice of their family physician, who was Dr. Bigelow, Jack took Isabella on the first of what would, on her first trip to Europe, back to Europe as an adult. And she obviously went back to Europe and traveled extensively after that. But as her world opened up with travel, her natural personal curiosity connected her to people and to places, and she really came out of her depression. Her growing intellectual curiosity reached a turning point when she met Charles Eliot Norton, who became the first professor of art history at Harvard. And later, he actually included her in his new Dante Society. He was the first person to translate Dante for the Harvard crowd. And the more Isabella Stewart Gardner learned, and the more exposure she had to this Cambridge intellectual life, the more she seemed to become herself. She not only was attending all-male Harvard lectures as a woman, she was collecting information, and really importantly, she was beginning to collect people. She was becoming friends with artists and writers, people who were different in some way and often overlooked by society, or who lived at society's edges, just the way that she had been. And with encouragement from Norton, Isabella began collecting rare books. She had an eye for beauty, for potential worth, and for elevating even a book of fairy tales to valuable collection status. Eventually, she would have more than 1,500 rare books, and that's what's in the museum now. As this journey progressed for her, she also began to amass art and architectural objects, and she ended up sponsoring one of Norton's students. This was Jewish immigrant Harvard student Bernard Berenson, who would go on to become one of the most famous art historians in the world, who, if you've read The Personal Librarian, I gather he makes an appearance in that novel. But this was a very big, lifelong relationship for the rest of her life and the rest of Berenson's life with her. Isabella's life, which was once lonely and marked by tragedy, became populated by an incredible array of artists. There were people like Henry James, people who adored her and understood her lively, outspoken nature. And she was friends with Henry James and exchanged letters for more than 40 years with him. He was really one of her closest friends. She was close with John Singer Sargent and Julia Ward Howe, who wrote Battle Hymn of the Republic and actually was her neighbor on Beacon Street, and Julia's daughter Maud. Isabella traveled the world. She went to Asia, she went to Europe, she even camped in the Middle East. And a side note, I don't often get to travel with my 4 kids. I didn't do a lot of travel research for all these books that I've written. But for this, I did decide that I would go do some research. And I decided that if Isabella had camped in the Middle East, I would camp in the Middle East. So while Isabella camped probably closer to what is now Saudi Arabia, I was not going to go there. I did end up camping in Oman. And there's a scene in the novel, it's one of my favorite scenes, where Isabella is in the desert and is holding another woman's child. And there's sort of ripples of sand. It almost looks like the ocean, but made of sand. And that was based very much on camping in the desert with camels and tents. So anyway, aside. So in The Lioness of Boston, Isabella comes into her own and she finds her life's purpose in collecting. She often returned to the Palazzo Barbaro in Venice, and she collected a lot from there. And this place held a real sense of beauty and calm that she kept with her. And while all of this is going on, of course, Boston is also transforming. Isabella is becoming herself, and we see Boston becoming the city it is today. So in the novel's pages, the reader will experience the building of the Natural History Museum. You'll read about the geographical complexities of Boston's elite Beacon Hill, which is positioned very much intentionally above and in contrast to the African American Meeting House that has been there since 1806. We learn about Rebecca Lee Crumpler, the first African American woman to earn an MD in the US. We witness the opening of Boston's beloved swan boats in 1877. That's another one of that was a chapter that I loved writing, the opening of that. And we read about the first Boston Symphony Orchestra performance in October of 1881. And we see through Isabella Stewart Gardner's eyes the Frederick Law Olmsted Public Gardens and Arnold Arboretum. And of course, by the end of the novel, you'll also understand Isabella's personal lasting contribution to the Boston history and landscape. When her father died in 1891, Isabella, who outlived her siblings, inherited his money and began using those funds to acquire significant works of art. Botticelli, Manet, Rembrandt, Vermeer, and many others, including Swedish artist Anders Zorn, whom she discovered at the Chicago World Fair in 1893. It's also where the Zipper was premiered, in case you were wondering the depths of my nerdy research that I had to do for this novel. So she acquired not only paintings, but actual architectural pieces, and soon her Beacon Street house was too small, even though it wasn't too small, it was too small to contain all of Isabella's ideas and her art. And so Jack, her ever-loving husband, broke through to the house next door, and soon those walls were also filled. Isabella delighted in hosting soirees and lectures with Harvard professors and nights of orchestra music. She sponsored a lot of young musicians, which ended up working in her favor, not only because she really relished those connections and sponsoring young artists, but also because when the museum opened, she asked the Boston Symphony Orchestra to play, and they, of course, said yes. And they played in the courtyard. As Isabella kept growing her personal collection, she decided the works belonged in a place larger than her Beacon Street home. She chose the location as the Back Bay Fens, which was then an urban wild area, which was part of of Olmsted's Emerald Necklace Park system. But it truly was just wild, if you've seen pictures of it. Boston did not understand what Isabella was doing. I think Boston didn't understand what Isabella was doing much of her life. But she really did plan to open this house museum with a structure inspired by her beloved Palazzo Barbaro in Venice. Isabella was 60 years old when she broke ground on the museum, and that's something that not a lot of people know, I think, but it's very exciting. We talk about, there's a phrase now that I'm not sure everybody has heard, but it's called a third act in life, and this really was her third act. So she was 60 years old, and the architectural pieces she bought, she wanted to use as structural elements for the interior courtyard of her museum. Architect Willard Sears was surprised and not entirely pleased to find out how big a hand Isabella wanted to have in the creation of this house museum. In fact, Isabella went to the building site each day carrying her own lunch pail and often asked that certain elements be moved or redone. Isabella Stewart Gardner found meaning in her life by sharing her love of art. With Bernard Berenson's help as her advisor, she created an extraordinary collection. Titian's Rape of Europa is among the 7,500 works of art in her collection. John Singer Sargent, who I said was another one of her close friends, painted her portrait more than once, including Isabella in a rather scandalous black dress that Boston deemed too risque and caused lots of scandal. But this scandal didn't deter Isabella from her ultimate goal, and she did have a goal. She was not just a collector, she was a collector with a mission, and her mission was to make art accessible to the public, which she did. Isabella Stewart Gardner became a living legend in 1903 when she opened her Italian palazzo-style home, which was then called Fenway Court, as a museum, showcasing her collection of old masters, antiques, and objects. And it was only after her death in 1924 that Fenway Court became known as the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. The New York Times called the museum Boston's beloved temple to idiosyncrasy. Aside from her artistic vision and arrangements of chairs, many chairs, desks, ceramics, master paintings, and Byzantine stonework, all arranged side by side. The Gardner Museum is famous because Isabella's legacy requires that nothing in the collection ever be moved and no works be brought in. Gardner's will states that, quote, if the arrangement of any of the museum's holdings changes, the entire collection, the building, and even the land beneath it be turned over to Harvard, end quote. Sometimes people ask me if I think that this was self-centered on Isabella Stewart Gardner's part or if she was just quirky. And I feel that Isabella wasn't an artist, but in The Lioness of Boston, I make it clear that the museum she created is basically a work of art created out of other people's works of art. So if you think of it that way, why would she want anything to be changed? It would be to dismantle this work of art that she had made. Guy de Maupassant wrote, our memory is a more perfect world than the universe. It gives back life to those who no longer exist. I think this was important for Isabella and important for me. As a writer, I've always been fascinated with memory. One way that we ascribe meaning to people and to events is to remember them. In writing The Lioness of Boston, this theme of memory and meaning was there right at the beginning. Isabella's directive shows someone who is both determined to keep everything as it was, someone who is resolved both to have their vision shared with others, but also in some way to be remembered, and to be remembered specifically in the way that she arranged. Art is another way of being remembered, or to fix a particular moment in time. For Isabella Stewart Gardner, art and objects were also a way of storytelling, and of sharing her large, complicated, unique, beautiful story with anyone who comes to Boston. And my hope is that the Lioness of Boston continues to share and reveal her story. So today we see Isabella as this trailblazer, a collector of diverse works, an art philanthropist with an eye to making all of that art accessible to the public. We see her as a woman unafraid of controversy, brave enough not only to speak her mind on the role of women in society and within art, but brave enough also, if rumor holds, to walk a pair of lions around the Boston streets. There's actually a great sketch, but we couldn't get it to come up tonight, of Isabella walking these lions around 1891. Isabella is one of the 7 wonders of Boston, and there is nobody like her in any city in this country, said the Boston Press. My novel, The Lioness of Boston, delves deeply into Isabella and Boston's interconnected histories. The novel is about what society expected a woman's life to be and how Isabella Stewart Gardner rebelled and determined to live on her own terms. Obviously, if anybody here is named Isabella or has a kid named Isabella, you have lifetime free admission to the museum. Because, again, quirky. And I'll leave you with a quotation from E.L. Doctorow. The historian will tell you what happened. The novelist will tell you what it felt like. So I hope you enjoy The Lioness of Boston, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Oh, the letters in the book? I made them up. Those are my creation. But it's great that you thought that they were real. Thank you. So the truth is that Isabella Stewart Gardner burned most of her personal correspondence. Yes, and so we have the letters that she exchanged with Henry James, some of those, and we have some letters with Bernard Berenson. But all the other ones, so as a fiction writer, I do a ton of research, whether I'm writing a short story or a medical article or this novel. But with letters, which played such an important role for everybody at that time, that was how people communicated, right? So the mail was delivered sometimes thrice daily. One of my kids asked, what comes after thrice? I said 4. So I knew that I wanted to have letters in here, but it is really hard when you have a limited amount of letters that remain to then retrofit scenes to make it work. And so I decided it was an all or nothing situation. Either I needed to have all real letters or no real letters. And it really didn't make sense to have, there really just weren't enough real letters. And so for this, I could really, if I'm doing my job as a creative writer, which, I'm guessing I did if you thought they were real, I can embody Henry James, and I can embody Julia, and I can embody the zookeeper, and really try to make their voices come alive and Isabella's come alive in the close way that people do in letters. That it's not a diary, but it's very, very close. And you're really able to tell a story in a letter and somebody in a different way. So it took a long time to write those letters, but I was a prolific letter writer. So it was something that I really enjoyed.
Thank you. This is lovely. I think we do think about words like trailblazer, pioneer. I was intrigued when you mentioned the influence that she would have had on Guggenheim, but I also think about the influence that she probably had on like Marjorie Merriweather Post and the work that she did to hold Hillwood together. Do you think she thought or knew about legacy and how she would be thought about as she was doing this? Or was this just important work and she thought this just needs to be done?
That's such a good question. I've been touring for a year and a half and nobody's asked me that, so well done. I think probably a little bit of both, because I think if she were not thinking about legacy, it wouldn't have occurred to her to say, you can't move anything, you can't change anything. At the same time, I think she did have a sort of, what needs to be done, and nobody's doing this, so I shall do this. So I suspect it's really sort of a nice marriage of both of those things. But I think she definitely had an eye to the future. I've thought a lot about what she would be doing if she were alive now, and I do think that she'd be an influencer. I think she would be on social media. I think she would be, broadcasting her brand and really creating a following. And I think she had an eye to the future. I think she understood that things change and really understood that part of grief is change and letting go, and a way to freeze time is to make things not change. Because there's so little, even the landscape where she built her museum had to change. And so the museum is really a rarity in that way. Yeah.
So do you know if there's any research about her knowing J.P. Morgan and Belle DaCosta Green? I did read the personal biography. Since they both started with collecting books, and then expanded to include art.
Right. I don't know the intricacies of that potential relationship, but Bernard Berenson, I guess. So I'm yes. Yeah.
How long did you take to write the book, and how did you write it? Did you write it 40 hours a week, or just maybe?
Yeah, that's a good question. It took me about 3.5 years, closer to 4, with the editing. So I started off researching, and at the beginning when I'm doing a ton of research takes up most of my time, and writing is a very small amount, and then they begin to trade places, and eventually I know enough and I've researched enough that I don't need to rely on the research anymore. I can really just write and then maybe refer to my notes. And when I first start writing, that's funny, most of the time when I first start writing, I sometimes write something and it's usually becomes something that's in the middle of the book, or it's something that gets left out of the book, something like that. With this, the first thing that I wrote was the prologue, and it's almost exactly the way it is now. So the first line I wrote was, "After I am gone, everything shall remain." And that's the first line. And then I wrote the first couple of chapters, and they were actually in the third person. And it wasn't working. And I stepped away for the better part of probably 6 months. And I went back and I looked at it and I thought, well, here's the problem. Isabella at the beginning has no friends. So a third person book with no friends sounds a lot like this. Isabella went for a walk. She was alone. She went to the garden. She was still alone. The wind blew. She had no one to talk to about it. So I realized this isn't working. So when I went back, but the prologue was in the first person, and I thought, well, that's working very well. Let me try that. So I wrote the chapter again in the first person, and the whole thing opened up. Because what's really fascinating about her is her interior thoughts, her mind. And so that's really how I started writing.
Did she have children? And if so, was it just quirky of her to leave all of this to be a museum?
She did have a child, but he did not survive. Yeah.
Have you been to her mausoleum?
In Cambridge?
Yeah, in Cambridge.
Yes.
It's pretty remarkable. It's large, it's got windows.
She didn't live a small life.
There's a red-tailed hawk that seemed to have taken up residence right up.
She probably put that in her will. But she, April 14th is her birthday. That's when those nasturtium, they're 30-foot-long nasturtium, are brought out every April because it's her birthday month. On April 14th, they ring a giant gong, which she commanded. So, yeah.
Is it true that Isabella spent her last years actually living in the museum? And if so, do you know why she?
She did live in the museum. There's an apartment on the top floor. And I think she did it because that was her house at that point. And she was very frugal. So one of the potential rumors was that some of the correspondence that she burned was to save money on heating costs. So I think she lived in the apartment upstairs. Yeah.
In Philadelphia, there's a comparable story about a man who was not accepted by society, Dr. Barnes.
The Barnes collection.
He said about buying paintings in Paris and all over Europe and assembling them in the South, just outside the city.
Right.
And he left similar kinds of instructions. Do you know if the two of them knew one another? Because what you described, her being is exactly the way he was when nothing new.
Right. I think that he followed in her footsteps. I think he was after she was, but I think he was very much influenced by her. That's my understanding. Yeah.
I'm curious, did you write on site? Did you go to the museum and do writing there yourself?
I did some writing there. I did most of my writing not there, just because of 4 children and time and various things. But I did do some there. And actually what gave me the idea for the novel was I had gone back to the museum a few years prior to the pandemic, and I kept to research a different book. And I kept overhearing people saying everything about the art or the heist. And I heard one person say, I don't even know how this museum got here. And I thought, oh no, nobody knows who this woman was. And so I would go home and tell my husband and 4 kids about what an amazing life she led, and that's how I came to write it. Yeah.
Can you tell the story of how you found out and sold it?
Yes. So that's my sister at the back. Thank you. So she's saying, can I tell the story of how I sold this book? Because it's actually kind of funny. So I finished the novel. I did all the writing, all the research, and I sent it to my agent. My literary agent, for people who don't know, is the next step before a book can become a book. So I send my manuscripts to him. He then sends it to publishers to see if they want to acquire the book to make it into a book in a store. So I sent it to Esmond. Esmond and I grew up, he's British. I grew up in London. We have a lot of stuff in common. And Esmond kept saying to me, I love it, darling. And that was great, except that it was the pandemic and everything was taking forever, and publishing was no exception. There were paper shortages, editors were working from home, a lot of publishing houses were going through big shifts, and so I've sold a novel, in a shorter period of time and a longer period of time, but it was anxiety producing because we just weren't hearing from publishers, and he kept saying, be patient, darling, be patient. I know it will sell. So I tried to be patient, darling, and it was really hard. So I told my husband about this, and he realized that I hadn't been back to the museum since I finished the book. So it was my birthday, and the Titian exhibit was there. And so he arranged a very special outing. This is right when things were opening up again, and everybody was going out in their masks like this, and with timed entry. And so he arranged for me to go, and he arranged for my dad, who's my best friend, to go, and my stepmom, and all 4 of my kids. And so they sort of walked into the museum, and that was a great surprise. And we saw the Titian exhibit. And then I said, while we're here, since I haven't been back since I sold the book, let's go visit with my favorite portrait of her, which is the Anders Zorn one, the Swedish painter. And you probably have seen it. It's not the John Singer Sargent one with the low neckline. It's the one where she's sort of in a doorway in Venice, and she's sort of like this, and she's wearing a white gown, and she's glowing with life. And she just looks so happy. And the funny thing about that portrait is, the Sargent is in this very cavernous grand room, and the Zorn is in what's called the short corridor. It's just in this cram-packed, full of art corridor. And so I said, everybody, let's go in and visit with this portrait. So we all went in with our masks, standing next to other strangers in our masks. And I sort of locked eyes with the portrait, and I decided I'd have a little conversation with her. And so I said, hello. And she didn't say anything back. I said, I wrote a book about you. It hasn't sold. But I just want to thank you for everything that you've done for Boston and for women in the arts and for leaving this incredible museum. I loved learning about your life, and I can't wait to one day share everything that I learned with other people. At which point my phone rang, and Esmond said, darling, we just sold the book. And I screamed, and my dad, Mr. Math and Science Man, screamed because it was truly ghostly and strange, and everybody around us sort of went, and so since then, I've thought I should go back and say, hi, Meryl Streep has not signed on to play you in the film. And just see if it's like, guess what, darling? But so that's the story of that. Are there other questions? Oh.
Did the research for this book take a lot longer than some of your other writings? Or on average, was it a lot more? Or?
It was a lot. It was a lot, but the novel I'm working on now required the same amount. So I think it just sort of depends. I can tell you in broad strokes what I'm working on. It is another historical novel told from the point of view of a woman who really lived and has really been forgotten, and somebody who lived amidst a group of writers and artists earlier, so more around the time of Jane Austen, both in England and in Europe. And so it's told from her point of view. I hope not next year, but the year after. So hopefully soon. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
It's been a long time since I've been there, but my remembrance was the extraordinary range of items that there are. I'm wondering if any countries have said, we need that back for any of the...
I'm not an expert on the provenance of all the items, but as far as I know, I don't think things have been asked to be given back, as far as I know. So that's good news for them. Nope, there's one more. I don't want.
Would you consider writing it as a biography as opposed to...
That is an excellent question. I have the skills to write many things. As you know, I write in nonfiction also. But the trouble with biography is the thing that I love to do is to make things up. And that is generally frowned upon in biography. And so what I realized was I'm much more in the sort of Camus camp, which is fiction is the great lie through which we tell the truth. And so that's much better use of my skill set to do exactly what Dr. O was saying. The historian will tell you what happened. The novelist will tell you what it felt like. And so that's why I chose the novel. But thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for being here.